All right, so we'll start by setting our motivation. So we'll think about generating those minds of refuge or confidence and bodhicitta. Thinking about wanting to follow reliable, repeatable, unmistaken path left to us by the Buddha for the purpose of becoming of incredible, immense benefit to sentient beings. Moving ourselves out of a state of confusion into a state of wisdom so that we might lead all sentient beings into that state of clarity, peace. So just on your own, try to generate that motivation of refuge and bodhicitta. All right. So I apologize for Monday's class. I don't actually know what happened. The internet seemed to just drop out completely, and it stayed that way for I believe the remainder of the time I was there or close to it. I still don't know if that was my Chromebook or if it was the actual internet. But it froze, my crashed, and I just couldn't do anything. So sorry about that. But we will resume with looking at day 104, where again Lama Zopa is taking us through the 9-point death meditation in a kind of step-by-step way, going through each of the points. So we're still on the main point of the uncertainty of the time of death. We've covered the certainty of death, and now we're covering the uncertainty of the time of death. And the quotation for day 104 is, "There are many more conditions for death than for life." So again, we might want to just remind ourselves that the point of these contemplations is to orient ourselves in a positive direction, not to get despairing or freaked out, but to be able to have the space and time in our lives for practice by developing the inner causes and conditions to move away from distraction, kind of meaningless activity, and be able to focus more on what is really critically important. So that's why coming to terms with our mortality is important. So with this one, we are, again, the whole point of the contemplation is to argue against the kind of default view of permanence that we hold in a deep sort of subconscious way in the mind, always putting off our death and thinking that, there's still yet more time. So to argue against that here, we contemplate all of the different ways, because we might, even when we do contemplate our death, really, for everyone, the only scenario that kind of comes to mind is being 105, and passing away peacefully in our sleep. That's kind of the one scenario that we generally kind of would feel comfortable with. And then, of course, if we make it to 105, then we think, oh, well, it's probably when I'm 106. So that's the problem. But here, we're trying to contemplate the other ways that we might die, that, of course, many people do die in many other ways. It isn't always kind of a gentle shutting down of the body that is due to just the wearing out of the body. Of course, with COVID, I think that was something that was kind of hit home for all of us. We saw, and it's getting better now, which is great. But there was a long period of time where we were seeing young, healthy people, and of course, that we also can say that that wasn't the norm, but the fact that it was covered kind of made us feel like we were vulnerable to that, where people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, were passing away, and even without any kind of comorbidities. And so that maybe helped in a way to recognize that the causes of our death are kind of lurking everywhere. We can get a foodborne illness that can progress. There can be even a very small cut, when we could be out, doing yard work, and there could be a very small cut that gets infected. There's many, not many, but there's people who just swim in a lake and they get some sort of parasitic infection. So there's all kinds of things. And then, of course, there's violent actions that people are subject to. There are car accidents, plane crashes, train derailments, train crashes, natural disasters. Of course, the earthquake, in Turkey and Syria is something like 45, 50,000 people that we know of right now. Passed away in a matter of hours. So again, the point is to just be in touch with what is true about our experience. It isn't to exaggerate and think, oh, well, this means that there will probably be an earthquake tomorrow, or, it isn't to take this to the point of being obsessed or being, going beyond the actual threats that we face. But it's just to recognize that we will have a death, and the cause, the circumstances of it, we probably are only thinking about as being the best possible outcome. and that is again very, very far out into the future. And we have to be honest with ourselves that there are so many other possibilities. Um, that the one that is occurring to us uh, may not be what actually occurs. Any thoughts or questions about that?
Venerable Dondrub, are we relying on or having faith in our practice so that, I mean, should we have a very fast death or a violent death or something that is not our ideal image, that dissolution that we have been practicing, will it happen? Won't it happen? Is there still a process, or are we simply jettisoned into something?
Yeah, so the teachings are clear that the process of the dissolutions happens for all. I don't know. It seems like it happens in a similar way also for animals, on because they talk about, when they talk about doing prayers and things, they talk about the 3 days, and so in terms of after when the breath stops. So it sounds like there's a high degree of confidence that humans and non-human animals, that broadly speaking, it happens similarly between the two. Um, and that for humans, and so, but of course, in other realms, I don't know. That seems to be a karmically established process, and humans and non-human animals are relatively similar enough in terms of carbon-based and the same sorts of things, that the body and the mind kind of work at least similarly enough in that way. And it doesn't matter how a person dies, the dissolutions have to occur either way in order for the mind to separate from the body. The difference is the speed with which the dissolutions happen. So for anyone, even a person who's undergoing a, a slow, process where they're just sort of in bed for several days, what have you, noticing the dissolutions is not necessarily that easy. Um, and particular, I mean, of course, particularly, I mean, from what I understand, I haven't studied it in terms of like reports from non-practitioners and that sort of thing. I've heard some anecdotes here and there about non-practitioners um, having that kind of death, and I have heard um, that sometimes they report some of the things, but then it's, of course, it's also true that many of them occur after a person is capable of saying anything or interacting in any way. So we can't really know whether or not they are noticing or observing what's happening. Um, but particularly, of course, the arising of the mind of clear light, that is something that in the teachings, it's very clear that it's so, generally speaking, so brief, um, that it's missed. That there's not any real conscious awareness for a non-practitioner, and that's kind of the most important part of the dissolutions from a Buddhist spiritual perspective. Um, Becoming familiar with the previous parts of the dissolution process, that is done so that you are prepared, like you're okay, this is where I am, this is what will happen next, to whatever degree. And then, they talk about the 80 conceptual minds dissolving. And at that point, I don't really know how that person, because the conceptual minds, you can't, I mean, because for us, I feel like most people think in words, and they think even when they're, you know, just sort of reading or daydreaming, or you're kind of using conceptuality to be aware. That's it's But when the 80 conceptual minds dissolve, then even that is gone. So really, you're kind of just in direct, just kind of non-conceptual awareness at that point. And I don't know what that's like. And subjectively, I don't know what that experience is like. But the goal of all of that really is to just hold the mind in the mind of clear light when it arises. The other stages, they don't have any utility, but it's good to know like which is arising and what is going to happen next, so that your mind stays sort of calm and peaceful, and that you are prepared for the arising of the mind of clear light. So if a person dies violently, they go through all of the dissolutions extremely quickly, depending on how violently they die. If a person dies slowly, then each individual stage takes more time. So a person who's experienced a very violent death, you wouldn't need to continue to like do prayers with the body past that point. If a person was in, say, like a car accident or a plane crash, and their body was really very badly mangled, they're almost certainly, I mean, if you have access to a high Lama, why not check? But generally speaking, it's quite certain that their mind has separated. Whereas if a person dies slowly and they're a practitioner, and I mean, maybe if they're an incredible practitioner and they die violently, maybe their mind is hanging around. But even for an ordinary person, the mind, after the breath stops, from a Buddhist perspective, the stopping of the breath is not death. Um, these dissolution stages, they haven't finished at the time that the breath stops. That for us is the moment of death, but that's not the moment of death from the Buddhist perspective. So that's why even if a person is ordinary, their mind is still associated with their body. If a person is a highly realized practitioner, that association can last longer than it would for an ordinary person. But in either case, if it's possible, and in the West, it's increasingly it's difficult to do that sort of thing where the body is maintained, in a bed for an extent, because it's considered a biohazard and there's laws, and it can be tricky, to do that. But it's generally practiced, if possible, that prayers are done with the body, up until there's a sign that the body and mind have separated. And usually that involves like a discharge, like blood from the nose, like some sort of discharge from an orifice, is because that's sort of the first sign of decomposition. Or if the smell, if the body starts to smell, if there's an unpleasant odor that arises. So when there's a clear sign that the body and mind have when the body has begun to decompose, then you know that the mind has separated, because a highly realized practitioner, if their body and mind have remained together, the body will remain fresh. The body will not begin to decompose. So, yeah. but with a violent death, the body and the mind almost certainly will separate, because all of the stages of the dissolution will be very rapidly progressed through. And that does mean that it's much more difficult to notice the arising of the mind of clear light. If that person happened to have been a practitioner, that's not the ideal for being capable of noticing the mind of clear light, because they probably weren't meditating prior. They probably, and there's so much damage to the body so quickly that the mind is just sort of separated quite quickly, and which means that the mind of clear light arose, but then in the next instant they entered the bardo, they entered the intermediate state. And even in the intermediate state, there are things that we can, like there's the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and there's teachings that we can take on the experience, the subjective experience that we might have in the intermediate state, because it's also useful to navigate that period. Of course, you are dead at that point. The body and mind have separated. The mind is in the bardo. That lifetime is totally finished, but the mind has not yet reincarnated. It has not yet taken a new form. So there are things that we can try to understand about those karmic experiences, so that perhaps we can still be calm and maybe remember some practice. And even if, even just by kind of remaining calm, and maybe the prayers that are being done might have effect, whether since we're not like freaking out, and so that's a separate kind of part of the process, but yeah.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. So then, yeah, he just continues in the next contemplation, day 105, by looking at, within the contemplation of there are many causes. One of the traditional contemplations is to think about the kind of body that we have. Because again, like I mentioned, even a tiny cut can bring about our death. The cut might be a eighth of an inch long, and our bodies are, we weigh 150 pounds, and but this tiny thing, because an even tinier virus or bacteria or something has entered that, and so the kind of body that we have isn't like an armadillo's body that can be hit by, a car and just kind of, tumble and be, fine. It's not a rhinoceros. We're not armored, we have a very fragile body. That's just the nature of this form, that we're presently appropriating. So, and then even like he says here, even the food that we eat, we have to eat, we have to drink, but we might eat something that's contaminated. We might drink something that's contaminated. So even the things that we do to prolong our lives can serve as what brings about our death. And he says, like allergies that people have too, like a bee sting, or or the wrong kind of food, peanut butter, or whatever a person's allergic to. There could just be a trace amount, a tiny amount, that they didn't know, and then they consume it, or they get stung, what have you, and they go into anaphylactic shock. So, and again, it's just, is that true? The Buddha is not trying to, again, cause us to think about, to exaggerate, or to um, make something up, but it's just to think about, is that a valid description of the kind of body that I have? Is that because the view of, what he's saying here too is that this view of permanence is kind of based on all of the experiences that we remember having. And all of those experiences, we were breathing, our heart was beating, and so we can only relate to our existence like that, because we have no other point of reference other than as this body and this mind, which is able to breathe at will, able to have their heartbeat, just autonomically. But he says there will come a point where we want to breathe in again and we can't. There will be a point in our life where that is the experience that we have. So, which is, and that's, there was we did the DB weekend on death that Steep did a couple months ago, and she was like, what concerns do people have about death? And like that's always been mine, like that moment where, because I had asthma like as a child, so I do kind of know what it's like to not be able to get a full breath, or not be able to breathe as you might prefer. So that, like, which is scary, particularly when you're a child and you don't, like there's this, there's a medicine that you carry with you, but like, where is it? Do you have it with you? Is it in the other room? Do you have to wait for someone to go get it? Like, those are all things that happened, multiple times. And I even, went to the hospital several times, because your brachial tubes and everything is smaller when you're a child. So it's more serious. And so that for me, like, even now when I think about death, that is the moment that I think about, like, then the desire to take your next breath, and it's just not happening because you're done, and that kind of that tension between wanting to remain in this life versus your body just saying, time's up. That's not what's going to be happening here. So yeah, trying to, but then recognizing, of course, that the mind, isn't the body, and the mind is experiencing the death process, but the mind is separate from the death process. The mind is observing or is noticing this process, but even after the breath stops, the mind is continuing to, in some way, I don't have any memory of it, I don't know what it's like, but the mind is continuing to be aware on some level of what's happening. And then the mind, in this unbroken continuity, because that's what the mind is. The mind is an unbroken, beginningless and endless continuity of mental moments. And so it's not like, we have one mind in this life and a different mind, there's some sort of like break in between, or it's an unbroken continuity of mental moments. So on some level, there is no death, there is no, and again, I can't be more specific than that, because have no idea what that's like. But the mind is still so in a way, I don't know if that's comforting, but maybe it's kind of comforting that it isn't that there's a ceasing, there's just a really dramatic state change. So, and then of course, but there is a ceasing on a gross level. There's of course a ceasing of the continuity of conscious memory and conscious ego identity that depends upon, so there is that really dramatic state change. That's true. But it's still the same mind. Um, any thoughts or questions?
Venerable, I think it was Woody Allen that said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens." And I think from a Buddhist perspective, it is more, I'm not afraid of dying, but I really want to be aware of it when it happens.
Yeah. So that's why, we've got better drugs and things now than they used to have, and so there's ways of dealing with pain that don't cause the same kind of loss of function, and so, but that's something to also be aware of, is like, how am I managing the death process? Because you want to try to be cognizant and present. Of course, then there will come a point, regardless, where that's biologically not possible, because again, with the dissolutions. But prior to that, you want to try to be able to be engaging in some practice. And so getting the right kinds of medications, and like I said, they have better ones now. So, but that's still like important to talk about with people, like if there's a choice, because our loved ones might have that perspective. They might think, well, just knock them out, just they don't, just kind of keep them totally sedated, totally out of it. And that might not be our wishes, for that time. And of course, none of us know how, because it can be, there can be many things that are really quite painful, and there, not everything may be available. Even though a drug might exist, might not be indicated, might not be possible. So there isn't to say that there's something wrong or shameful, or if you need to manage something in a way where there is some sort of impact that's not ideal. But to the, because I've certainly, not recently, but I've prayed for death just from a migraine. I've been in which is because you kind of go crazy in that, you're not thinking clearly. It's not, you're not planning it, but you're just like, this is intolerable, and just please, knock me out, and I don't care what happens. And that's, I've had that experience. So of course, it's not a judgmental kind of a thing, but in an ideal world, we want to think about how we can try to practice as much as possible around that time, is my only point. Any other thoughts or questions? So day 106, here, Lama Zopa is sort of directly giving us the point of all of this. He says, a Dharma practitioner's fear of death acts as a wake-up call. So he says, how do we turn our current way of living around completely? By remembering impermanence and death. Without that strong spur, it is difficult not to be lazy. We think that Dharma is a nice idea, but somehow never quite get around to practicing it. As long as the world seems comfortable and the experience of sense pleasure is the real reason behind our actions, he says we'll never be successful. If we face the imminence of death, however, we will quickly realize that what we need to do, and we will quickly realize what we need to do, and will have the energy to do it. So again, he's saying that, it's our current experience that we are motivated, mainly just to have pleasant worldly experiences and to avoid unpleasant worldly experiences, because we can only, again, our imagination is limited. We have only ever remembered experiencing those sorts of things, and so we project that into the future indefinitely. We think, the way that I'm able to navigate the world and, be alive and be aware, that is all that there ever has been. So I can only imagine that that's all that there ever will be. But not true, because there will be this dramatic experience, and then we'll be off having a very different kind of life after that. And so if we don't continually remind ourselves that that is true, that that is valid, that that is an accurate way of describing our existential experience, then the pull of pleasant experiences, unpleasant experiences, that will just continue to remain what drives all of our choices, all of our decisions. And it's only by, or largely by, really coming to terms with everything that's going to happen after the moment of death, and exactly how all of that works, that we can have the space in our mind to make different choices and different decisions. He says, if we live next to a river that is rising and about to flood, we shouldn't wait until the water is pouring in to our house before doing something to escape. We need to see the danger and take precautions before it's too late. In the same way, we need to take precautions so that we can die with a virtuous mind and be assured of a positive rebirth. So it's, again, just to be aware that we're not going to be successful in not dying. So there is this rising flood. The flood waters are approaching, day by day, minute by minute. This is becoming more and more likely with every passing moment. So in the same way that we would do everything that we could to try to navigate that situation and have it turn out well, he's just saying we need to also have that kind of view about our own impending death. We need to do everything that we can while we are here to create the causes and the conditions for that to work out well, so that it's not a missed opportunity, so that there are no negative consequences or from failing to prepare. Because in the same way, if you see an actual rising flood and you don't do anything, it's not going to turn out well. But but the difference here, in a way, is that with that external analogy, it could be that there's only so much you can do. Like, you can try and it may not work. And, to some degree, we have to acknowledge that that is also true with this, because, again, we could die today. And have we done enough, up until now? Maybe, maybe some people have, maybe other people haven't. But at least with this, we do know that it is entirely possible, in not an unlimited amount of time, just given, I can't, because, it depends on how much effort and how much seriousness. And I mean, there's factors. It isn't just you can say, oh, this many days or this many years, or there are factors that are involved. But it is entirely within our capacity to be able to die well. And it's certainly better, regardless of how much more time we think because we don't know. Person can be however old and think they only have this, but really it ends up being much longer. And of course, the reverse is also true. A person quite young, they think they have this incredible amount of time, ends up being quite short. Both true. But whatever we can do, all of the karmic seeds, the virtuous, positive, constructive tendencies, habits, seeds that we plant in the mind, they are not lost. They have their own efficacy, their own power, their own capacity. So it's, even if there's only a short amount of time, still better to do everything that we can do to use that time well than it is to not do that. Because all of the seeds and all of the positive energy that we're putting into the mind will remain in the mind and will bring about beneficial effects. So, it could be that maybe there, we can't say that the very next lifetime, maybe it's true that we didn't shift that, but we did perhaps create a karmic seed that will ripen in not too much more time, that will ripen as the lifetime where we achieve enlightenment. Because we meet teachers again and so on, all of the causes. And so we can't say it's entirely linear, but we can never really be sure how that particular karmic seed will ripen. So all we can do is try to create as many of them as possible. Because then once we achieve enlightenment, then we're done. We've done it. And the goal is to try to do that as quickly as possible. But the only method for that is dedication and time and effort and seriousness. And it doesn't matter whether we do that for, I mean, of course, there's a difference between doing that for a week or doing that for 50 years, but still, we don't know which of those is going to happen. So we just have to do our best and be as consistent as we can. Any thoughts or questions?
Venerable, it brings to mind the encouragement that you gave us the other night about cultivating or developing bodhicitta all the time in all circumstances, and it really hit home to me. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to connect this well, but I once heard the phrase that the last 7 mind moments of your life are the most important, in terms of being in a frame of mind that's conducive to the death process. So your words the other night about developing that, or about being in that state of bodhicitta all the time, no matter what, that it's at the post office, it's at the, wherever, whenever, gives me the confidence and encouragement to feel as though I have the opportunity to go into death in a better state of mind, because hopefully, and that doesn't happen all the time, but it certainly happens more and more, to be in that state of mind, to be aware and to be positive and to be supportive of others, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, thank you. I don't know where I was going with that, but
Yeah, no, certainly the mind that ripens at the time of death is the mind that determines what karmic seed becomes active at that time. But so there are cooperative causes and conditions, like trying to practice hearing mantra, seeing holy objects, hearing prayers and practices. And so there are cooperative causes and conditions that can try to move the mind in a positive direction. But what we do in this life is the most important determination of what is more likely to ripen. If we spend this life killing and stealing and being, lying and being deceitful and trying to, be manipulative and, totally self-centered to the point of being willing to harm others to get ahead or get what we want, all of that familiarity is going, that person hopefully still would hear mantra and hear, still, but they've not set themselves up very well. They've made it, those external cooperative causes and conditions, hopefully, or the power of prayer or the intervention of an enlightened being or something, hopefully would still, but they've not given themselves the best chance because of what they used this life to become deeply familiar with. But if we do the opposite of that, if we do use this life as consistently as possible to become deeply familiar with positive mental states, then we are setting ourselves up to where, even if, we're kind of alone or it's not entirely ideal, and that's, we'll get to that contemplation. That's the contemplation there is only our practice is of any, actually that's where we are actually right now, that he's going to go through. Only our practice is of any value to us at the time of death, regardless of what those circumstances are. It's the practice that we've done that is of value to us at that time. And that refers largely not to the practice that we are doing at the time of death, but all of the things that we've done in our life to kind of tip the scales, karmically speaking, to build up the kind of networks of virtuous thought and virtuous action and the sort of default inertia in that direction that we've generated. Because a person who's deeply familiar with that, they find it quite easy, just like if a person steals all of the time or lies all of the time, then in a situation where there's temptation, where that's what they're gonna just do that again. They're gonna lie again. They're gonna steal again, because that's the inertia that they've built into the mind. But if a person gets into the habit of, rejoicing and dedicating and aspiring to be of benefit, and all of these positive mental states, and having developing patience, developing generosity, all of these default modes, then going into the death process, that kind of inertia is what is most predominating in the mind, because we've built it up over years. Yeah. We might just not go into the next. We might leave that only our Dharma practice is of any benefit, that those contemplations for Monday, but rather than start them with just a couple of minutes. Any thoughts or questions or anything that would be useful for today? Nope. All right.
I
So
actually
we,
have a
yeah,
question.
sure. Sorry.
Sorry,
Yep.
I can't get my picture up there. I have no idea what I'm doing. But so what about like the at the end of life for somebody who takes their own life? I'm not, how does that? Not that I'm thinking of it. I'm just so curious.
Sure.
I work with a lot of people like that.
I mean, there's not. You can't really say that there's a fixed rule about it. It's not. It isn't something that's generally encouraged in Buddhism. Um, but
Okay.
again, like I said, that's not a judgmental thing, because people are dealing with incredibly painful, incredibly difficult circumstances, which is another reason why we have to recognize we might face that. And so, can I try to be someone, just like we might, as someone who drives a car, normally it works out fine. Like, there's some traffic, there's maybe some rain, some snow, but it's not like super challenging. There's not like you don't have to be a IndyCar driver to be able to. But sometimes it's really helpful, because you do meet a really, like, black ice or something. And if a person doesn't know that they need to turn into the skid, and like when to apply the brakes, and then they're going to crash. But if the person has that training, they can even deal with that and be okay, because they've spent time getting the skills. So that's something to think about, is, developing the capacity to be able to patiently accept really difficult circumstances, which doesn't, again, it's not a judgmental thing, because being an IndyCar driver is a very rare thing. So I am talking about being, kind of a rare person who's capable. So for most people, they are meeting with a really difficult circumstance, and they may not be able to see a different way of dealing with it. So, but there is something, generally speaking, the mind that isn't able to face what's happening, that kind of, because the Buddhist perspective is that, so it, like I said, there's no absolute right or wrong, or this is how it would go, or that's how it would go, because a person might have a clear recognition that, that there is a next life, and that they have prepared for it, um, and they're just at a point where their body is kind of pretty close to just being done, and that there isn't really any value in prolonging that. So maybe taking the right kinds of medications to where it's peaceful, and and there's still clarity of mind, and they go into it really with a positive, very clear, very. But then, of course, there are other people who might have the view that there is nothing at death, and the death is a complete destruction, and so, like, what's the point? Because there's no. And then for that person, I mean, either way, that's not from the Buddhist perspective, that's not a constructive view to have, because it's going to impact what a person is willing to do, because they're really convinced that when they die, that's just the end. And so there's no point in trying to die with a positive mind, to die, because nothing is coming after that. So yeah, I mean, the kind of, it really depends on the attitude that they have going into that. Broadly speaking, it isn't something that is encouraged in the Buddhist way of thinking. It's not actually, though, a complete karma of killing for the person who is choosing it for themselves, because they die, the moment of their death happens before their mind can perceive that they were successful in killing themselves. So it's an incomplete. So to have a complete, karmically speaking, to have a complete karmic act of killing, the the person engaging in the action that brings about the death of the sentient being that's being killed, that mind has to persist and observe that the action that they thought was going to lead to the death of that sentient being actually did lead to the death of that sentient being. And that doesn't happen when you're killing yourself. So it's an incomplete karma of killing, which is karmically speaking better than a complete action of killing. But there is perhaps kind of a defeatist attitude, or, you know, and again, it's really not trying to be moralistic or judgmental about it. It's just talking about the consequences of some energies that are different than other energies. So, but yeah, if a person, is really positive and they're just like, hey, let me get to, and then also, I mean, Buddhist teachers would also kind of talk about interrupting the karmic process that's happening, and how that might not be ideal. So if a person's dying, then a karma is ripening for them to have a particular disease, whatever it might be. That's a particular karmic seed that's ripening and generating that experience. If you then introduce something new, like a drug cocktail or something that you're injecting, then that previous karma that generated the cancer, what have you, it hasn't finished. It's still operative. Whereas if they died kind of quote unquote naturally, it would finish at the moment of death. Whereas the cause of their death isn't the illness, the cause of their death are the drugs that they're taking. So in that way, that previous negative karmic seed might be able to impact the death process, or the experience of being in the intermediate state, in a way that wouldn't be true if that karma finished at the moment of death, naturally, because it was the karma that caused the death. So there's that consideration. as well from the Buddhist perspective. But the main thing, you know, if a person was around another person who was choosing that, then the main thing would be, as you would normally do, I would, you know, would be the same. The main thing would be to really try to help them to have that positive mind, to think, you know, and of course that doesn't mean like giving them a philosophical view or a religious view that they don't have, um, but to just try to help them think good thoughts, you know, whatever. If they do have the idea of heaven, then you're like, yes, absolutely, you're going to heaven. You know, the same thing that you would do regardless of what, you know, how they're dying. You would still, that would be the main thing, is to kind of help them to generate the most positive mind that they could generate at that time.
Mhm.
Is that helpful, or did you have a different way of thinking about your question?
No. It's helpful. I mean, it's just I was curious, like, you know, how like the rebirth process is for them, and that just like understanding what happens like at the end for them.
Yeah. All right. So we'll leave it there for today. And so we will dedicate. So we'll recollect our altruistic motivation and think that having contemplated and thought and participated in the course, we actualize that positive motivation, which created positive energy in the mind, and that positive energy will bring a virtuous, useful result, positive result. And so we just strongly imagine and think that the result that it brings is of enormous, incredible benefit to countless sentient beings. Thinking when it ripens, may it ripen in incredibly beneficial and vast ways. So just on your own, try to think about all of the extraordinary, vast benefit that can arise from positive energy that you've created on behalf of countless sentient beings. All right. Well, have a good weekend, and we'll pick it back up on Monday.